Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Westdale Book Club. Uh, this is a new initiative that we've started at the Westdale Theater. I want to make sure people are hearing me and seeing me okay. The chat window is open. If anyone could comment on whether I'm being seen and heard okay, I'd appreciate that. The Westdale Theater is in Hamilton, for those of you who don't know. And a group of volunteers about 3 years ago raised some money and restored a beautiful old theater. We were operating for about a year, and then we had to close due to the crisis. And we've launched these online film clubs and also this Monday night film talks. And this has really been a lot of fun, and a lot of people are joining us. And we're going to be continuing to do this throughout this period of time when we have to be closed. So my name is Fred Fuchs. I'm the chair of the Westdale, and my background was as a movie producer many years ago. And I'm really enjoying talking about some of the great films that influenced me and many others, sharing some stories about the films, and also answering questions. The chat room is open, and people should feel free to make comments about the talk and also to ask any questions or talk about their favorite scenes or anything that's of interest. And besides this Monday night film talk, we are also have created a number of film clubs that are much smaller members, only about 10 to 12 people in each club. And they're based on different genres, and they happen once a week with wonderful moderators, all professional people from the film industry. And if you're interested in joining one of our film clubs, please go to our webpage, the Westdale, or you can ask questions at info.thewestdale.ca. And I encourage you to join one of the clubs, and they're much more interactive. We use the Zoom platform so everyone is seen and heard, and just another effort we're making to create community and to allow people to watch great movies and talk and keep busy during this time when we're all so isolated. So tonight, it's a lot of fun for me to be able to talk about Forrest Gump. This obviously movie was incredibly important film at the time it was made. It was very influential in many ways. And I watched it again this week. I hadn't seen it for probably 10 years. And I found myself still completely swept away into this story, into this incredible character, and actually reflecting on, seeing this film now 25 years, 26 years after it was made. It's quite interesting to see how much thematically what this film was about is still so relevant to our society today. And I thought that would be something interesting to talk about as well, besides some of the more technical aspects of how the film was produced and some of the behind the scenes stories. So again, please comment on the chat room, and I'll try to answer questions either as we go or at the end. But first of all, let's set the little context around when Forrest Gump was made. It was released in 1994 by Paramount Studios. This was probably not the most exciting creative time in Hollywood, unlike the early 70s, which we talked about, with our last two films, American Graffiti and Chinatown. Just to give you an idea, the other movies Paramount was making at the time were Clear and Present Danger, a Tom Clancy novel, Star Trek, another Star Trek, Beverly Hills Cop 3. It's not that there weren't a few wonderful films. This was also the year of Pulp Fiction, the year of Shawshank Redemption, Quiz Show, Four Weddings and a Funeral. But for the most part, the studios were pretty much trying to stick with blockbusters or big action movies or comedy movies and there weren't that many efforts to do original and unique work. And in fact, Forrest Gump at the time was considered somewhat of a commercial project. It wasn't necessarily considered a great, innovative independent film. But I think within this commercial film, we actually can see a lot of very unusual things that were going on that have made it, at least in my opinion, stand up so well today. Um, so the development of this film is interesting. Of course, it's based on a book. I don't know if all of you are familiar with that or not, but in 1986, the book Forrest Gump came out, and it was written by Winston Groom, who was actually quite a well-known novelist. He was a Pulitzer Prize winner. But the book was actually quite different than the film. The book was a farce. It was not terribly well received at the time. And in the book, Forrest Gump is 6'6" and 250 pounds. And although he is a lovable and again, a character with a low IQ and doesn't test well, and some of the stories are the same about going and playing on a football team and going to Vietnam and playing ping pong. There were many other aspects to the story that were quite different. He becomes a famous professional wrestler. He becomes an astronaut. He never marries Jenny. There's no son. And at the end of the book, he's a street musician living with a pet orangutan in New Orleans. But the basic concept, though, of portraying the world and viewing the world simply and truthfully is the same. In the book, he's actually an idiot savant and is brilliant in mathematics, and he can do feats of strength, and there's quite a bit of sexuality in the book and profanity. Just to give you an idea, the author's idea of who should have played Forrest Gump was John Goodman. So quite different than the film adaptation. And but of course, it became the basis, and this character became the basis of one of the most beloved films of all time. And this really is a life-affirming and hopeful story, and a story of a man who, in a way, embodies the American dream and does achieve incredible success. So the development of it really started with the author, the screenplay, adaptation, which was written by a fellow named Eric Roth. And Eric Roth is one of the top Hollywood screenwriters, has been for many years. He had already been working in the industry, of course, wound up winning an Academy Award for Best Adapted Screenplay for Forrest Gump. But you may know him from other movies he went on to write, including The Insider, Munich, The Curious Case of Benjamin Button, and he was also one of the writers of A Star is Born that came out recently. Another wonderful script he wrote that Tom Hanks starred in was Extremely Loud and Incredibly Close. And he was also one of the executive producers who first brought House of Cards to life for Netflix, which was the first drama that Netflix, of course, ever did. I had the good fortune to work with Eric Roth for a number of years on a film called The Good Shepherd that ultimately did get made in 2006. Eric had the idea to work and to tell the story of the CIA in a similar way that Francis Coppola had told the family story of the mafia. And this original screenplay of Eric's came in at around 325 pages and probably should have been a novel. But I did have a chance to sort of see how he worked. He had a very literary approach. He did an enormous amount of research. He was an incredibly hard worker and would continue to try and improve and change things. And I can imagine his experience working on Forrest Gump was pretty similar. The script was 9 years in development. It was not an easy film to put together and to get financed. It was a literary approach. The structure of the script is very unusual and certainly was in 1994 because, of course, it's all these different segments. It's episodic. It's not one kind of traditional narrative. And it was also quite fanciful as originally created. And besides all of this unusual idea of placing Forrest Gump into all of these historical settings and using existing documentary footage to do all this, it also had crazy elements like every time you saw Jenny, she always had angel wings on, and Lieutenant Dan always had a cloud over his head. And so, it like most films in Hollywood that seem so obvious now, there was not necessarily an easy path to get this film made, and it took quite a while. Now, some people believe and have said that the original cast for this, or the original choice the studio wanted for to play Forrest Gump, was actually John Travolta, and I'm not sure if that's actually true or not. I do know that Eric and Tom Hanks were already friends, and Eric was writing a script called The Postman for Tom Hanks to star in that ultimately got made years later with Kevin Costner starring in it. But the story goes that John Travolta was offered it first and turned it down, and went on to star in Pulp Fiction again that same year. And of course, he was actually also nominated for an Academy Award that year and lost to Tom Hanks. And Bill Murray and Chevy Chase's names are also mentioned as being potential Forrest Gumps before it was offered to Tom Hanks. But again, I'm not completely sure of whether that's true or not. And then the same thing happened with directors. The fantastic director who won an Academy Award for his directing, Bob Zemeckis, was supposedly not the first choice for the director either. And the director who was first offered the film was actually Terry Gilliam. And Barry Sonnenfeld was considered for directing. But Bob Zemeckis, of course, did become the director, and of course did such a spectacular job, and his background with visual effects certainly made him, perfect for the part. What else can I tell you about the development? Again, this is it when it came out, there was some criticism of the film that it felt it was too sentimental, that some of the story was too obvious, that it wasn't a sophisticated drama. But I think some of that was absolutely intentional, and the writer and director and the studio were trying to make a very broad, a very accessible movie. They had a very clear intention, and the book itself had a clear intention about what it was about and what it had to say about the human condition and about disabilities. And I think they really did an incredible job to make this film, and of course it became one of the most successful films of all time, work and still works today. And so many of the classic lines that came from this script are just memorable, and they became almost catchphrases. And in fact, there was a book that came out called The Wit and Wisdom of Forrest Gump, with all of these great lines, as stupid is as stupid does. My name is Forrest Gump. You can call me Forrest Gump. And even simple lines like "Run, Forrest, Run" by the screenwriter repeating it again and again almost became like an anthem. And of course, many of the scenes that are in the movie were not in the book. The whole running sequence was not in the book. That was all added by Eric in his screenplay. Some of the sequences around the Lincoln Monument, at the Lincoln Monument with the reflecting pool, were all original lines, original scenes. And then, of course, as you develop a screenplay, things come from real life. They come from expressions you've heard. One interesting aspect or a great line in the film was when Forrest Gump was running across the country. There was actually a real event where their 16-year-old boy who ran through the country, ran across the country for American Cancer. And when he asked how to did it, he did say, "I just put one foot in front of the other. If I get tired, I sleep. When I get hungry, I eat. When I have to go to the bathroom, I go." Well, that line wound up in this movie. Ed Forrest says that when he's talked to. Another example of adaptation from the book is that in the book there was an expression, being a idiot is no box of chocolates. Well, Eric Roth turned that into, my mama always said, life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. So quite different than one than the book originally, was. And Tom Hanks, who was 36 at the time, was really coming into his own as a great actor. He had actually just won the Academy Award the year before for his role in a fantastic film called Philadelphia. And then he won again this year for Forrest Gump in 75. And this was the first time an actor had ever won two Academy Awards back to back since Spencer Tracy did it in 1936 and 1937. Zemeckis also won the Academy Award, and Zemeckis had an interesting evolution as a director. He went to USC, as many other filmmakers did, and his mentor was Steven Spielberg, and who first found him. Zemeckis won an award for a great student film he did, and Zemeckis was a comedy director, and that was really the focus of the kind of work he did, coming up to this film. He, of course, had did Romancing the Stone. He had also directed Back to the Future, and he did a movie called Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which you may remember was a combination of live action and animation, and was always someone with a lot of great strength in special effects and state of the art, use of technology. And he continued to do that after this movie. He pioneered performance capture techniques in a movie again with Tom Hanks called The Polar Express. So, and of course, he turned out to be the perfect person to direct this film and did an absolutely extraordinary job. And again, like most films, a lot of lines, different things were improvised as time went on. And in fact, that famous line, "My name is Forrest Gump, people call me Forrest Gump, you can call me Forrest Gump," was completely improvised by Hanks on the set. For the role of Jenny, the first actresses that were approached were Jodie Foster and Demi Moore, who both supposedly turned down the part. Nicole Kidman did refuse to do a screen test. But of course, when Robin Wright came in to do her screen test, they all knew they had found their Jenny. Robin, of course, had been acting since she'd been 14. She was a model and she had been in soap operas, and first got noticed in a wonderful movie called Princess Bride, and then it has gone on to become quite famous for her role on a television series, House of Cards, which was the first Netflix, television series. And interestingly enough, the executive producer who put that series together was Eric Roth. So Gary Sinise is, fantastic. He received a nomination for supporting actor. Gary was a great theater actor. He'd come from Chicago and Steppenwolf, John Malkovich's theater company. He also became a great director, but this was really his first big movie role. After this, he went on to do Apollo 13 and Truman and George Milton and Of Mice and Men, and of course, Mac Taylor in CSI, for many years. His character was an interesting and very, had very much its own arc and its own development, and it's really another story of disability, right? Because Lieutenant Dan suffered some form of PTSD probably, and of course with no legs, and of course it all winds up with this triumphant moment when he jumps off the boat and can swim, and then later when we see him at the funeral with his new legs. Very important, aspect of the movie, and really reflected the theme of people overcoming handicaps and the power of our intentions and our willingness to continue to grow. Also, of course, Sally Field. Now, the interesting part of Sally Field, the role playing Mama, is that Sally is only 10 years older than Tom Hanks. And in fact, several years before, they had actually played in a movie together as boyfriend and girlfriend. But Sally Field, was a quite well-known actress and brought so much of her own personality and her own character to this part, and everybody, loved Sally Field. So it was obviously a great choice for the mother, even though she was completely age inappropriate for the part. The production of the film was, needless to say, very complicated. There was a $55 million budget, which was, pretty large for the time, because, it was a big film and was going to be a long film, and of course required all these visual effects. The principal photography in 1993 took place mainly in Georgia and North Carolina and South Carolina. There were few odd sequences. The college scenes were done in Los Angeles, I think at USC. Of course, there were some running scenes that were done in various places. But what's quite extraordinary was that all of the Vietnam footage was actually shot on a golf course in South Carolina. And this is one of the most remarkable things about this film, is that even that location was able to be enhanced by visual effects. If you recall, there are mountains, that you can see mountains in the background in those scenes, and you get this, very good representation of what we think Vietnam looked like, and they never left South Carolina. And, I'll talk more about these visual effects, but what was so remarkable is that visual effects, were of course always used for, for Star Wars and big, science fiction movies. But this was an incredible example of how visual effects were used to really just to enhance a drama, and the visual effects in a sense were invisible, and you were not supposed to be or pay attention to visual effects, and this was all just going to be there because it made the production and made the story so much more interesting. Uh, Now, an example of one thing that people often think is a CGI effect, but I understand wasn't, was the opening shot of the film, which, as you recall, is this feather. And this feather is sort of magically floating here and there and winds up drifting and drifting through the credits and then winding up at the feet of Forrest at the bench. And as I understand, this was not CGI. This was actual footage of a feather that was shot, drifting and floating, and many different ways that it just naturally blew. And then it was composited with a background plate that was the town square and the sky, and then ultimately the actor. And it's very, very effective. And of course, it really does set the tone for the whole film, and really speaks to what the film is about. In fact, if you remember in one of the last scenes of the movie, when Forrest is at his mother's grave, he actually says, "I don't know if we each have a destiny, or we're just floating around accidental, like on a breeze, but maybe both." And actually, I don't believe in the original script that the feather was there at the end of the movie, and that was something that was decided to be added after, in production, because they found it so successful, and they could see what a great, metaphor it was for the whole film. The voiceover, of course, was such a critical part of the film and the script. It was the way to get through all of these different major episodes, and to help, bring some continuity to the whole movie. And one of the interesting things they did was, instead of doing the voiceover later on in a studio, which is, the way it's traditionally done, all of the voiceovers were actually shot during production, with Tom Hanks actually performing the voiceovers, on camera, even though the intention was they were not going to be on camera, to try to keep this sort of more lively and more, just to give it more life. the episodic nature of this story was challenging. If you notice, they never show the dates. They never tell us what date it is when you're doing. Um, they did something that was quite wonderful, which is if you notice each sequence, Forrest is wearing a blue checkered shirt. And it can be a different blue checkered shirt, but they're all blue checkered shirts. And it's sort of a visual cue to the audience. We're now entering a new sequence, be it, he's, the many different sequences we have. And of course, the other wonderful continuity of the script is that after each major sequences, he goes home. And this, of course, is also very different than the book, but this idea of returning home and home being, his place and that this is where he's always drawn back to, really gave an overall kind of continuity to the storytelling that I think was, part of why it's very smooth, even though episodic. Of course, there were all these amazing scenes from history and footage, real footage from history, where Forrest is superimposed, incredibly effective. Interestingly, the first one was not actually, they actually shot and created some archival footage when we see Tom Hanks himself dressed up as General Nathan Forrest, who Forrest is named after, and who started the Ku Klux Klan, and that's sort of fake footage. There was one additional sequence that was shot. It was one of the first sequences. It was in the script that ultimately is not in the cut, and that was a sequence with Martin Luther King. And Jenny and Forrest are about to go off to university, and they're crossing a bridge, and they see the Selma March, the famous march in Selma, one of the first freedom marches. And there's, Martin Luther King leading the march, or Martin Luther King Jr. leading the march, and they're sort of the police bring out these dogs to sort of attack and harass them. This is, of course, a true story. And Forrest Gump jumps into the mix, and he knows all the dogs, and he manages to get them to all calm down and follow him instead of harassing the marchers. But it didn't make it into cut, and as I was told, the sense was that this was not a sequence that should be poked fun of or in any way, you know, presented in less than the importance of what that moment actually meant in history. One of my favorites is the one with Governor Wallace, who I don't know how familiar you might be, but was quite a notorious character, ultimately ran for president. This was when they were trying to integrate the schools, and we see Forrest jump into the scene, and then of course he finds the book that the black girl student had dropped and picks it up and gives it to him. How they did this is kind of interesting. The sequence with LBJ was actually when he was giving, President Johnson was giving the Medal of Honor to Sammy Davis in 1968. And in this case, they just were able to put Hank's head onto Sammy Davis's body, and that's how they made that footage work. One of the things that I've always found interesting in the production was that anytime you see Forrest Gump in a photograph, there are a number of times you see him in different pictures when he becomes a celebrity or he's on a magazine or anything else like that. In order for the director wanted him to continue to appear awkward, even off camera, you'll notice his eyes are always closed, which makes the photograph somehow seem odd or somehow not completely right. Another wonderful little tidbit about this film is that Tom Hanks had to work very hard to get his accent, the Southern accent right. And of course, there was some conversation about toning it down and not doing the Southern accent, but I think everyone realized that was such a critical part of the character. And what happened was they had hired this young kid, of course, to play, his name was Michael Connor Humphreys, to play young Forrest. And after listening to him and meeting him and talking to him, Tom realized that trying to mimic the voice of the young person would work so effectively, both in terms of matching up, with the young Forrest, and also it being such a pure and authentic accent in itself. So I think that's kind of interesting. What else? So another incredible sequence to me was when Forrest finds Jenny playing in this strip club, and she's there singing, in the nude, blowing in the wind. Not an easy sequence for the actress. In fact, she was quite sick that day and spent 12 hours, largely undressed, trying to shoot the scene. But she persevered. And of course, in terms of Jenny's character, that was a very important scene for her. And of course, the relationship between Jenny and Forrest is really the heart of the film. And of course, the idea of them getting married and having the child was not in the book. This was all things that were added by the screenwriter, and their efforts to really make something more accessible and more, and not just a farce. This was really real drama. Uh, Tom Hanks is actually not a very good runner. And many of the running sequence were actually, they used his younger brother, Jim Hanks. You can actually see Jim Hanks, on camera, especially in some of those scenes with his beard. And it's it's not Tom, and anyhow, but it was very effective. And in fact, the running sequence is interesting because they almost didn't get to film that whole sequence of the movie. They film was running over budget and it was late and it was one of the last scenes they were going to do, and the only way that it got done was both Tom Hanks and the director agreed to pay for it and to give up some of their salary in order to be able to shoot the running sequences, which they thought were very important. And because they did give up their salary, instead they got back end in the film, which turned out to be much more valuable than the salary would ever have been. So it's sort of just interesting how these things evolve. And of course, the idea of the running, was very was very popular. Of course, in the late '60s, early '70s, this whole idea of jogging, became very popular. I think this was also sort of a metaphor for how people were starting to become so attracted to different kind of gurus and trying to find people to follow and sort of instant celebrity. So there are quite a few different aspects to that sequence that I thought were very effective. Some other interesting production notes were, of course, when Forrest is playing ping pong. There were no ping pong balls. Tom Hanks did not become this superb, ping pong player. Though ping pong balls were all CGI, they were real. Were all added later. And Tom would just get up there and start swinging that paddle as crazy as he could, and all the ping pong balls were added, and it seems incredibly effective. It worked really well. Another one of my favorite sequences is also created, was only be able to be created because of CGI and technology, and that's the scene at the peace rally at the Lincoln Memorial with the reflecting pool, where Forrest suddenly winds up, with this line of vets, and and they're he's up on stage, and that's Abby Hoffman, supposedly, of course, in the American flag shirt, and and of course, they only had 1,500 extras that day to shoot that scene, and they were able to create this, sense of 100,000 people through the great use of visual effects. After each take, you'd shoot a take, and then you'd take your 1,500 extras and move them to another part of the shot, and then you move them to another part of the shot, and ultimately composite them all together. All the visual effects were done by ILM, George Lucas's company, and were absolutely revolutionary and state of the art at the time. That sequence is also very interesting because, of course, this idea of what does Forrest actually say when he speaks to the crowd. because there was a lot of controversy among the writer and the director and Tom. What was he going to say? How in a very short speech could he sum up his entire experience in Vietnam? And they wanted it to be humorous and brilliant, and Eric Roth couldn't come up with anything great. And in fact, he turned to his friends, comedians like Billy Crystal and Robin Williams, to see if they could come up with anything, and no one could really come up with anything great. And then the director had this brilliant idea that just before Forrest speaks, that this guy standing by the monitors pulls the plugs out of the speaker system, and nobody hears what he says except Abby Hoffman. But of course, when you cut back at the end of the speech, it's clear that he said something completely brilliant, and affected everybody. And to this day, nobody knows what he said. According to Tom Hanks, this is what Tom says he said. Sometimes when people go to Vietnam, they come home to their mamas without any legs. Sometimes they don't go home at all. That's a bad thing. That's all I have to say about that. But again, I'm not sure. Gary Sinise's role, of course, was all done with visual effects. Incredibly done with his missing legs in all sorts of scenes and all sorts of positions and ways. That was mostly achieved by covering his legs with a blue fabric or a blanket, which then they had to, remove in post, shot by shot, and literally frame by frame. An incredible amount of effort, but it made his character so powerful and so interesting. And I just love the sequence. Again, these were some, improv. Making a film is magic, and you never know what's going to happen when you allow the actors to participate and talk about different things. So it was the scene when when Forrest finds Lieutenant Dan in New York City, and he's pushing him on the wheelchair through the New York City traffic. And Sinise bangs on the taxi and says, "Hey, are you blind? I'm walking here. I'm walking here," which of course is a direct line from Midnight Cowboy. And later, when they went to add the music for the film, of course, they used the famous song from Midnight Cowboy, "Everybody's Talking," that was recorded by Harry Nilsson. And it's quite a wonderful little moment in the movie to me. Music, of course, was a huge, huge part of this movie, and that was the intention from the start. And although you can look at some of the music choices today and think, oh, they're probably pretty cliched, when Jenny's in L.A., doing drugs, and you hear the Doors, L.A. Women, and of course the Vietnam music, with Hendrix and Buffalo Springfield. But at the time, this cliche of using songs over film like this was not so cliched, and I think it was very effective. And some of them were just amazing. Leonard Skinner's "Freebird," during the acid trip, and I think really added a lot. Of course, there was the wonderful sequence with Elvis, right, where Elvis stays at their house when Forrest is just a young boy, and of course Forrest's wonderful dancing moves become the inspiration for Elvis's, dancing on with Hound Dog. And there was an actor who was actually playing Elvis, but the voice and the singing was actually dubbed later by Kurt Russell in an uncredited cameo. Kurt had actually played Elvis in a movie and was a singer, and he sounds very much like Elvis probably did sound. Um, and then, of course, at the end, it's both so tragic. Jenny dying of AIDS. I mean, they don't ever say it's AIDS, but that's what one would have to assume about that, and that's probably what it was, and not inaccurate. Her journey, of course, it's some critics call it sort of very cliched or typical, but it was just true. This was what happened in the 60s. And of course, she comes from, having this abusive father and people from and probably an alcoholic and falls into drug addiction, and after suffering child abuse. It was, not inaccurate, and AIDS, of course, was just coming onto the scene, and people really didn't know what it was and how it was affected, and they didn't know how to treat it, and very tragically, of course, the end. But then, with young Forrest, I don't know if you recognized him or not, but he was actually played by a young actor who went on to become quite famous as well, Haley Joel, I'm sorry, yeah, Haley Joel Osment. He later on was in a movie called The Sixth Sense that you might remember, the M. Night Shyamalan movie with Bruce Willis, and he also starred in Pay It Forward and had quite a successful career. A couple of questions that people were asking about, for example, how did they shoot the football games? Well, this was a situation where they actually shot these in California at, I believe it was the USC, the Coliseum, and these indeed were probably actually filmed. This wasn't just superimposing Tom into a existing footage. This was probably a case where they did bring in a lot of extras, and maybe they multiplied the extras later. But at the same time, it's very effective and very, very funny sequence, and also did actually, originate with the book. Okay, so at the release, it just, again, critics were not the hugest fans, but some absolutely got it. And there was one particular review I read by Roger Ebert, who at the time was the top film critic. And he said, "I've never met anyone like Forrest Gump in a movie before. And for that matter, I've never seen a movie quite like Forrest Gump. Any attempt to describe him will risk making the movie seem more conventional than it is. But let me try. It's a comedy, I guess, or maybe a drama, or a dream. The screenplay by Eric Roth has the complexity of modern fiction. The performance is a breathtaking balancing act between comedy and sadness in a story rich in big laughs and quiet truths. What a magical movie." I think you get reviews much better than that. It was the #1 box office grossing movie of the year. It competed with Lion King, which also came out that year, but they both grossed somewhere in the neighborhood of almost $700 million, which was a tremendous amount of money at the time. At the time, it became the fourth highest grossing picture of all time. And Paramount Pictures had just been bought by Viacom, and they desperately need a big box office hit. And although they did invest a lot of money in the movie, it really paid off. And of course, suddenly Viacom looked like geniuses for having bought Paramount. As I mentioned, it went on to many Oscars: Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Screenplay, Best Visual Effects, Best Editing, and won 6 Oscars. The greatest hit soundtrack also became an enormous success. First of all, you may note that all the songs were American songs. There were no songs done by anybody else. And as the music producer Joel Sales said, we wanted to have very recognizable material that would pinpoint time periods, because again, there was no indication of actual dates. And we didn't want to interfere with that, what was happening cinematically. So there was a 2-disc album, and it became #2 on the Billboard chart. It went on to sell 12 million copies and was one of the top-selling albums in the United States for years. And of course, the VHS cassette and the soundtrack became staples of many, many American homes. For many people, for better or worse, this is a movie where a lot of young people learned about American history, which they didn't get in history class. Desegregation, Vietnam, AIDS. It really is a powerful piece of historical storytelling. Another amazing thing that happened is Bubba Gump shrimp restaurants became a real thing. They exist. There are 33 locations all over the world. It became very successful. Lieutenant Dan, Gary Sinise, has a band called, Lieutenant Dan, and he plays often for military occasions, or, travels to military bases to perform. So, what's this movie about? I'd love to hear a little what maybe you guys want to say about it. What we do know is that, one theme for sure is that there's a huge amount of freedom that comes to you if you take nothing personal. And of course, that was Forrest Gump. He himself would not had no idea what he was going to become. Nobody could predict how his life would turn out. His life shows that a person's true potential is unknown, but with, hard work and toil and training, we can accomplish things we could have never imagined. There have been many, many psychology papers and courses, that's talked about Forrest and, what 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 does this represent, and what was trying to describe his condition, and but again, it all comes back to, I think, this same idea that that one's skills and abilities and intelligence are not fixed or carved in stone, and they can change. You can improve your attention, your ability through efforts with practice, with training and help for others. And he ultimately became, very successful person on many levels. Um, Again, this idea of not taking anything personal, and also not focusing on the consequences, even from the beginning when the boys are chasing him, he just runs away. He's not worried whether it would appear dumb or not. He just left. When in college, he's not worried about whether he'd succeed or be a, football star. He just did what he was supposed to do. In the army, it's never about being accepted or rejected. He did what everybody told him to do, and he winds up with a Medal of Honor. And even, playing ping pong, he just did that for fun. He was in all these competitions, but whether he won or lost was not, he does not take anything personal. And as Mama Gump says, what does normal mean anyhow? He might be a bit on the slow side, but my boy Forrest will get the same opportunities as everyone. And he's not going to go to a special school to learn how to retread tires. And again, that she believed that not, Forrest and of course other people with, mental illness or other disabilities and challenges can succeed and can be very successful lives, but they need to be given the opportunity. They need to, be believed in and not just, pigeonholed and put away. And I think the film did start, more conversation about mental health and disability and the problems with early diagnosis and the need for education. And of course, Gump, Forrest was not afraid of anything. He wasn't afraid of making any mistakes. Eric Roth's mother used to say to him that famous old adage, handsome is as handsome does. And this is a saying that's appeared in, Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and Billy Budd, and can be traced back to 14th century. But Eric reinterpreted, as Mama always says, and of course it's repeated several times in the movie, stupid is as stupid does. So, what does that mean? You're only stupid if you act stupid. It's the result of one's actions, right? It's not, what people might say. And all the things, that it was the results that matter, and that's what he cares about. And that's what people care about. And that's what we should all care about. And that's what, affects so many other people around us. There was a sequel that was written for the film. It was, of course, such a huge success, and it had many, many amazing sequences. Forrest becomes a great ballroom dancer. He's actually in the back of OJ's white Bronco and popping his head up now and again. But the script was delivered the day before 9/11. And after 9/11 occurred and the mood of the country really changed, both Eric Roth and Tom Hanks, I think, realized that this was not the time for this film to be made and come out. And I think its time has come. So let's see, I want to answer a few questions. I'm seeing this. Yeah, someone's commented, to me, it's the life of a man with the spirit of a child, perhaps the best way to be. And I agree. This is a character who comes with great heart and love to the world. He comes with an openness. He is impeccably honest. I think the idea of telling a lie or not expressing himself honestly was just inconceivable. He never learned how to do that. And I think it's just amazing when you can see with that kind of childlike simplicity what happens, you know, and the effect he's able to have. And I think this is one of the reasons this resonated with families and people of all ages. And that's right, his actions matter more than his than well, the actions did, you know, often come to be successful results, but he always acted in a way that was pure and consistent to his basic belief in life. Uh, so, you know, this chatting is to me not the best way to do interactive film conversation, and that's why we formed the film clubs. And some are full, but there are new clubs forming, and a great opportunity for you folks to join a club and see a great film during the week. Again, mostly we try to use Netflix or other easy ways for people to see films. And then with small groups, there's really an opportunity to have a lot more discussion and a lot more, because you know everybody has their own experience of a film, and there will be a moderator who will help talk about the film and also answer questions. But but I think this has turned out to be a good format, and people seem to be enjoying it. And of course, it's all free. So for me, I'm going to do one more of these next week. After that, we're going to start to have some guest speakers. In fact, in 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about a film called The Fellowship of the Ring. And giving the talk will be Colin Doncaster, who's an Academy Award winner, a visual effects expert who actually was in New Zealand working with Peter Jackson and Weta Films during that time, and has some wonderful stories and can talk quite a bit of length about the film. And you know, Fellowship of the Ring, of course, was the first film that Peter did and how it all came about. But next week, I'm going to be back, and I'm going to talk about a film back again to the early 1970s. I think my favorite time in film history. And I'm going to talk about a little film called The Godfather. And although many of you have probably seen this film, there are some great stories about it that you may or may not know. And if you're not, you can get it and watch it again on Netflix. But what I also would recommend is that while I was working on Godfather 3, we produced a documentary called The Godfather Family, A Look Inside. And it started out just to be one of those making ofs, you know, that films often, you know, shoot while the film's in production. But we found all this incredible footage also from back from Godfather 1. In fact, included in this documentary, you'll see the screen tests that were originally done with Al Pacino and Diane Keaton. You'll also see screen tests of Jimmy Caan auditioning for Michael, because the studio actually wanted him to play Michael and they never wanted Pacino. You'll see Marlon Brando. You'll also see Robert De Niro auditioning to play Sonny Corleone, a part that he did not get. But of course, then he went on to star in Godfather Part 2. So again, you can find a link for it at our website. Obviously, also come to our Facebook. But I think if you have a chance to look at this documentary, you'll find it interesting. And I look forward to talking to everybody next week about The Godfather and answering, again, any questions you might have. And I just appreciate, I hope this is an opportunity for all of you to do something a little different and to, during this period of isolation, that we can all get together and talk about films is a wonderful thing. I know I've enjoying it tremendously. So anyhow, thanks all. I try to keep this to an hour, and we're about run out of time, but I look forward to seeing you all again next week. Take care. Bye-bye.